The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand estate as security guard Marcus Thompson adjusted his radio and began his usual patrol. At 42 years old, Marcus had worked at Highgrove House for nearly 8 years, and he knew every corner of the sprawling property like the back of his weathered hands. His thick-soled boots made soft thuds against the polished marble floors as he walked through the corridors, checking doors and windows with the methodical precision that had made him one of the most trusted members of the security team. Marcus had always been a man of routine. He arrived at work every morning at 6 sharp, checked in with the night shift supervisor, and began his rounds. The estate was massive, with dozens of rooms, multiple wings, and extensive grounds that required constant monitoring. But Marcus never complained about the work. He found comfort in the predictability of his duties, and he took pride in knowing that his vigilance helped protect the important people who lived and worked within these walls. On this particular Tuesday morning in late September, everything seemed normal. The autumn air carried a crisp coolness that made Marcus grateful for his thick uniform jacket. He had already completed his first sweep of the East Wing and was making his way toward the nursery area when he heard something that made him pause mid-step. It was a sound that didn't belong in the carefully orchestrated quiet of the morning routine. The crying was faint at first, barely audible above the distant hum of the heating system. Marcus stopped walking and tilted his head, straining to listen. There it was again. The unmistakable sound of a child in distress. His heart began to beat a little faster as he quickened his pace toward the source of the sound. Marcus had been around long enough to know that the nursery wing was typically off-limits to security personnel unless specifically requested. The protocols were clear. Family areas were to be respected, and guards were expected to maintain their distance unless there was a clear security threat. But as he drew closer to the nursery, the crying grew louder and more desperate, and Marcus felt his professional instincts warring with his human compassion. He had 2 children of his own, a daughter who was now 15, and a son who had just turned 12. The sound of a child's distress triggered something deep within him that had nothing to do with his job description and everything to do with his fundamental nature as a father and protector. Marcus had always believed that his primary duty was to ensure the safety and well-being of everyone on the property, regardless of their age or status. As he approached the nursery door, Marcus could hear not only the child's crying, but also raised voices from within the room. One voice belonged to a woman, speaking in sharp, clipped tones that conveyed frustration and impatience. The other voice was smaller, more frightened, clearly that of a very young child trying to explain something through tears and hiccups. Marcus pressed his ear closer to the door, knowing that he was already bending the rules but feeling compelled to understand what was happening. The woman's voice grew louder, and Marcus caught fragments of words that made his stomach tighten with concern. She was speaking harshly to the child, using language that seemed far too severe for someone so young. The child's response was heartbreaking, a series of gasped apologies and promises to be good, delivered in the trembling voice of someone who was clearly terrified. Marcus felt his jaw clench as he listened to the exchange. In his 8 years at the estate, he had never heard anything like this coming from the nursery. The staff he had encountered were always professional and caring, and the atmosphere in the family areas was typically one of warmth and security. Marcus glanced up and down the corridor, checking to make sure he was alone. He knew that his next decision would likely have consequences for his career, but he also knew that he couldn't walk away from what he was hearing. The child's distress was escalating, and the woman's voice was becoming even more agitated. Whatever was happening in that room, it was clearly getting worse, not better. He thought about his own children and how he would want someone to respond if they were in distress and he wasn't there to help them. The image of his daughter's face when she was upset flashed through his mind, followed by memories of his son crying after a nightmare. The parental instinct that had guided him through countless moments of his own children's difficulties now demanded that he take action. Marcus took a deep breath and made his decision. He would knock on the door and offer assistance, citing a routine security check if necessary. It wasn't entirely truthful, but it would give him a reason to be there and an opportunity to assess the situation firsthand. If everything was fine, he would apologize for the interruption and continue his rounds. But if the child was in danger or distress, he would find a way to help, regardless of the potential consequences to his career. The crying from within the room grew even more intense, punctuated by what sounded like the child calling for her mother. Marcus felt his resolve strengthen. Whatever protocols he might be breaking, whatever rules he might be bending, he couldn't stand by and listen to a child suffer when he had the power to potentially help. He raised his hand to knock on the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of determination and anxiety. Marcus Thompson had always been a man who followed orders and respected authority. But in this moment, his humanity overrode his training. The sound of Charlotte's cry had awakened something in him that couldn't be ignored, and he was about to step across a line that would change everything. The nursery door stood before him like a barrier between his old life of quiet compliance and a new reality where he would have to choose between his job and his conscience. Marcus knew that once he knocked on that door, there would be no going back. But as another sob echoed from within the room, he realized that not acting would be a betrayal of everything he believed about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Marcus straightened his shoulders, adjusted his uniform, and prepared to face whatever consequences his actions might bring. The child's safety was more important than his career, and he was ready to prove it. The sound of his knuckles against the nursery door would echo through the corridors of the estate and through the rest of his life, marking the moment when Marcus Thompson chose to be more than just a security guard. He chose to be a guardian in the truest sense of the word. The silence that followed Marcus's knock seemed to stretch for an eternity. Inside the nursery, the crying stopped abruptly, as if someone had pressed a pause button on the distressing scene. Marcus waited, his ear still pressed close to the door, listening for any indication of what was happening on the other side. He could hear whispered conversation, urgent and hushed, followed by the sound of footsteps moving across the room. When the door finally opened, Marcus found himself face to face with Camilla Hartwell, the head nanny who had been with the family for almost 3 years. She was a woman in her mid-50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to assess everything and everyone with cold efficiency. Marcus had encountered her only a few times during his rounds, and their interactions had always been brief and professional. But now, seeing her in the doorway of the nursery, he noticed things he had never observed before. Camilla's face was flushed, and there were beads of perspiration on her forehead despite the cool temperature of the room. Her usually immaculate uniform appeared slightly disheveled, and her hands, which she kept clasped tightly in front of her, showed the telltale tremor of someone trying to control their emotions. Most telling of all was the expression in her eyes, a mixture of anger, frustration, and what Marcus could only describe as barely contained fury. "Yes?" Camilla's voice was crisp and formal, but Marcus detected an underlying tension that confirmed his suspicions that something was very wrong. "Is there something you need, Mr. Thompson?" Marcus glanced past her into the room, where he could see little Charlotte Wellington, the 3-year-old daughter of the estate's owners, sitting on a small chair in the corner. The child's face was red and blotchy from crying, and she was clutching a stuffed rabbit so tightly that her knuckles were white. Her dark hair was disheveled, and she was wearing a pale blue dress that was now wrinkled and stained with tears. Most heartbreaking of all, Charlotte was trying so hard to be quiet and still that her entire small body was rigid with the effort. "I was conducting my routine security check," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm and professional despite the anger that was building in his chest. "I heard some disturbance and wanted to make sure everything was secure." Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line, and Marcus could see her calculating how to respond. She stepped slightly to the side, partially blocking his view of Charlotte, but not before he caught sight of the child's tear-streaked face and the way she flinched when Camilla moved. "Everything is perfectly fine here," Camilla replied with forced brightness. "Charlotte was having a small tantrum, but it's all sorted now. Nothing that requires security attention, I assure you." Marcus nodded slowly, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he took a small step forward, bringing him closer to the doorway. "May I just have a quick look around the room? Standard protocol when there's been any kind of disturbance." It wasn't standard protocol at all, and both Marcus and Camilla knew it. But Marcus was betting that the nanny wouldn't want to make a scene by refusing his request, especially when her behavior was already questionable. He watched as Camilla's jaw tightened, but after a moment's hesitation, she stepped aside and allowed him to enter the nursery. The room was beautifully decorated in soft pastels, with hand-painted murals on the walls depicting scenes from classic children's stories. Expensive toys were arranged on shelves and in corners, and everything spoke of care and luxury. But Marcus's attention was immediately drawn to Charlotte, who was still sitting rigidly in her chair, her wide brown eyes fixed on her lap as if she were afraid to look up. "Hello there, Charlotte," Marcus said gently, crouching down so that he was at the child's eye level. "How are you doing today?" Charlotte's eyes flickered up to meet his for just a moment before darting nervously toward Camilla. The fear in that brief glance hit Marcus like a physical blow. This was not the normal wariness that some children showed around strangers. This was the look of a child who was genuinely frightened and unsure of what might happen next. "Charlotte is fine," Camilla interjected quickly before the child could respond. "She was just being difficult about her breakfast, weren't you, Charlotte?" Sometimes children need firm guidance to learn proper behavior. Marcus noticed how Charlotte's small body seemed to shrink even further at Camilla's words, and how her grip on the stuffed rabbit tightened. He also noticed that the child's breakfast tray, which sat on a nearby table, appeared to be untouched. The porridge in the bowl was cold and congealed, and the fruit that had been arranged alongside it looked as if it hadn't been disturbed. "Is that right, Charlotte?" Marcus asked softly, ignoring Camilla's obvious discomfort with his questions. "Were you having trouble with breakfast?" Charlotte's mouth opened as if she wanted to speak, but then she closed it again and nodded uncertainly. Marcus could see that she was torn between wanting to tell someone what was happening and her fear of making things worse for herself. "She's been very stubborn lately," Camilla said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made Charlotte flinch again. "Children of this age often test boundaries. As I'm sure you know, Mr. Ralph Thompson. They need consistent discipline to learn right from wrong." Marcus studied Charlotte's face carefully. The child looked exhausted, as if she had been crying for a long time before he arrived. Her cheeks were still damp with tears, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. Most concerning of all, Marcus noticed what appeared to be red marks on Charlotte's upper arm, partially hidden by the sleeve of her dress. "Charlotte," Marcus said, his voice even gentler than before, "would you like to show me your breakfast? Maybe we can figure out together what might make it taste better." For the first time since he had entered the room, Charlotte looked directly at him, and Marcus saw a flicker of hope in her expression. But before she could respond, Camilla moved quickly to intercept. "I really don't think that's necessary," the nanny said firmly. "Charlotte needs to learn to eat what's prepared for her without making a fuss. Coddling her will only make her behavior worse." Marcus stood slowly, his mind working to process everything he was observing. The dynamic between Camilla and Charlotte was clearly unhealthy, and the child's behavior suggested that this wasn't the first time she had been subjected to harsh treatment. But Marcus also knew that he was walking a delicate line. He was a security guard, not a social worker or a child care expert, and his authority in this situation was limited. "I understand the importance of discipline," Marcus said carefully. "But I also know that Mr. Sec and Mrs. Wellington would want to be informed if Charlotte was having ongoing difficulties with meals or behavior." Camilla's eyes flashed with something that looked like panic before she quickly regained her composure. "That won't be necessary," she said. "I've been managing Charlotte's care perfectly well, and her parents trust my judgment completely. There's no need to trouble them with minor disciplinary issues." Marcus nodded as if he accepted her explanation, but internally he was making plans. He couldn't confront Camilla directly without more evidence, and he couldn't risk making things worse for Charlotte by escalating the situation prematurely. But he also couldn't walk away and pretend that nothing was wrong. "Well," Marcus said, moving toward the door, "I'm glad to hear that everything is under control. I'll continue my rounds now." As he reached the doorway, Marcus turned back for one final look at Charlotte. The child was watching him with an expression that broke his heart, a mixture of disappointment and resignation that no 3-year-old should ever have to wear. In that moment, Marcus made a silent promise to the little girl. He would find a way to help her, no matter what it took. "Have a good rest of your morning," Marcus said to Camilla, though his eyes remained on Charlotte. As he walked away from the nursery, Marcus could hear Camilla closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. But he could also hear something else, the sound of Charlotte beginning to cry again. Quieter this time, but no less heartbreaking. Marcus continued his patrol, but his mind was no longer on his usual duties. Instead, he was formulating a plan that would allow him to protect Charlotte without putting his job at immediate risk. He knew that he would need to be careful and strategic, but he also knew that he couldn't let another day pass without taking action. The sound of Charlotte's cry echoed in his mind as he walked through the corridors, a reminder of the trust that had been placed in him by a frightened child who had no one else to turn to. Marcus Thompson had always been a protector, but now he was about to discover just how far he was willing to go to live up to that role. Marcus spent the rest of his morning patrol in deep thought, his mind racing as he tried to figure out the best way to help Charlotte without making her situation worse. He completed his rounds mechanically, checking locks and monitoring security cameras, but his attention kept drifting back to the nursery and the frightened little girl he had left behind. Every time he heard a door close or footsteps in the corridor, he wondered if it was related to Charlotte's situation. During his lunch break, Marcus retreated to the small security office where he often ate his sandwich in peace. Instead of relaxing, however, he used the time to review what he knew about the Wellington family and their household staff. Marcus had access to personnel files as part of his security clearance, and he decided to take a closer look at Camilla Hartwell's background and employment history. What he discovered was both illuminating and troubling. Camilla had been hired 3 years ago with glowing references from her previous employers, but Marcus noticed that her employment history showed a pattern of relatively short-term positions. She had never stayed with any family for more than 2 or 3 years, which was unusual for someone in her profession. Most experienced nannies, especially those working for wealthy families, typically built long-term relationships with their employers. Marcus also noticed that Camilla's references all came from families who had since moved abroad or were otherwise difficult to contact. While this wasn't necessarily suspicious, it did make it harder to verify her actual performance in previous positions. The personnel file contained her initial background check, which had come back clean, but Marcus knew that background checks only revealed criminal convictions, not complaints or concerns that might not have reached the level of legal action. As he sat in the quiet office, Marcus thought about his own children and the caregivers they had had over the years. His wife Sarah worked as a nurse, and they had needed after-school care for their kids when they were younger. Marcus remembered how carefully they had interviewed potential babysitters and how they had always trusted their children's reactions to different caregivers. If either of his kids had shown the kind of fear and distress that he had seen in Charlotte, he would have immediately removed them from that situation. Marcus finished his sandwich and made a decision. He would begin documenting everything he observed, creating a record that could be used to protect Charlotte if the situation escalated. He started by writing down everything he had witnessed that morning, including the exact time of his visit to the nursery, the condition he had found Charlotte in, and Camilla's responses to his questions. After completing his notes, Marcus realized that he needed to find a way to observe the situation more closely without raising Camilla's suspicions. He studied the security patrol schedule and the layout of the estate, looking for opportunities to monitor the nursery area more frequently without appearing to single it out for special attention. The solution came to him as he reviewed the building plans. The nursery wing was adjacent to the library, which was part of his regular patrol route. By timing his visits to the library carefully, Marcus could potentially hear what was happening in the nursery without being detected. The walls between the rooms weren't particularly thick, and sound traveled easily through the older sections of the estate. Marcus also decided to pay closer attention to Charlotte's overall well-being during any chance encounters he might have with her around the property. The Wellington family occasionally took walks on the estate grounds, and Charlotte sometimes played in the garden areas that were visible from Marcus's patrol routes. By observing her behavior in different settings, he might be able to better assess whether the problems were confined to her interactions with Camilla or if they were part of a broader pattern. That afternoon, Marcus implemented his plan. He adjusted his patrol schedule slightly, adding an extra pass through the library area around the time that Charlotte would typically be having her afternoon snack. As he approached the library, he could hear voices from the nursery next door, and he positioned himself near the shared wall to listen. What he heard confirmed his worst fears. Camilla was berating Charlotte for some minor infraction, her voice cold and harsh as she criticized the child's behavior. Charlotte's responses were barely audible, whispered apologies and promises to do better. Marcus could hear the fear in the little girl's voice, and it made his stomach clench with anger. "You're such a difficult child," Camilla was saying. "Your parents work so hard, and this is how you repay them? By being stubborn and disobedient? No wonder they're always too busy to spend time with you." Marcus felt his hands curl into fists as he listened to Camilla's cruel words. To tell a 3-year-old that her parents didn't want to spend time with her because of her behavior was psychological manipulation of the worst kind. Marcus knew that the Wellingtons were indeed very busy people. Mr. Wellington was a prominent businessman who traveled frequently, and Mrs. Wellington was involved in numerous charitable organizations, but they were also loving parents who adored their daughter. Charlotte's response to Camilla's verbal attack was heartbreaking. The little girl began to cry again, but quietly, as if she had learned that loud crying would only make things worse. Marcus could hear her asking if her mommy and daddy would still love her if she was good, and begging Camilla to help her be a better girl. Marcus had heard enough. He couldn't stand by and allow this psychological abuse to continue, even for another day. But he also knew that he needed to be strategic about how he proceeded. Bursting into the nursery without a clear plan could result in his immediate dismissal and would leave Charlotte more vulnerable than ever. Instead, Marcus decided to seek out Mrs. Wellington. He knew that she was scheduled to return from a charity luncheon that afternoon, and he planned to request a private meeting with her under the pretense of discussing security arrangements. Once he had her attention, he would carefully present his concerns about Charlotte's care. Marcus spent the remainder of his shift observing the estate's rhythms and waiting for the right opportunity to approach Mrs. Wellington. He watched from a distance as Camilla brought Charlotte outside for some fresh air, noting how the nanny maintained rigid control over every aspect of the child's activities. Charlotte wasn't allowed to run or play freely. Instead, she was required to sit quietly on a bench while Camilla read a magazine nearby. The difference in Charlotte's behavior when she thought she was unobserved was striking. When Camilla briefly went inside to take a phone call, leaving Charlotte alone in the garden for just a few minutes, the little girl's entire demeanor changed. She looked around cautiously, as if making sure she was truly alone, and then began to play with some fallen leaves, her movements becoming more natural and childlike. But the moment Camilla returned, Charlotte immediately stopped playing and resumed her rigid posture on the bench. The transformation was so dramatic that Marcus felt his heart break for the little girl who was clearly living in a state of constant anxiety and fear. When Mrs. Wellington's car pulled up to the main entrance that afternoon, Marcus was ready. He had prepared what he would say, thinking carefully about how to present his concerns in a way that would be taken seriously, without seeming like an overreach of his authority. As Mrs. Wellington emerged from her vehicle, Marcus approached respectfully. "Mrs. Wellington," he said, removing his cap, "I wonder if I might have a brief word with you about a security matter." Eleanor Wellington was a gracious woman in her early 30s, with the kind of natural elegance that came from good breeding and careful education. She had always treated Marcus and the other staff with kindness and respect, and she had a reputation for being genuinely caring about the people who worked for her family. "Of course, Marcus," she said, using his first name as she always did. "What can I help you with?" Marcus glanced around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "Perhaps we could speak privately in your office? It's a rather delicate matter." Wellington's expression grew serious as she nodded and gestured toward the house. "Certainly. Let's go inside." As they walked toward her private study, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was about to potentially destroy a woman's career and disrupt a household, but he was also about to potentially save a little girl from ongoing psychological harm. The thought of Charlotte's frightened face gave him the courage to continue. Mrs. Wellington closed the door of her study behind them and gestured for Marcus to take a seat in one of the comfortable chairs arranged near her desk. "Now then," she said, settling into her own chair. "What's on your mind?" Marcus took a deep breath and began to tell Eleanor Wellington everything he had observed about her daughter's care. As he spoke, he watched her expression change from polite attention to growing concern, and finally to barely controlled anger. When he finished his account, the room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. "My daughter," Mrs. Wellington said finally, her voice very quiet and very controlled, "has seemed quite subdued lately. I attributed it to a phase she might be going through, but now—" She paused, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Marcus, I want you to know how grateful I am that you came forward with this information. Not everyone would have had the courage to speak up." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he also knew that the difficult part was just beginning. "What would you like me to do, ma'am?"
Mrs.
Wellington stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the garden where Charlotte and Camilla could be seen returning from their afternoon outing. "I'm going to handle this very carefully," she said. "I want to observe the situation myself before I take any action, but I also want to make sure Charlotte is protected in the meantime." She turned back to face Marcus, her expression determined. "I'm going to ask you to increase your security checks in the nursery area. Make them frequent and unpredictable. If Camilla knows she might be interrupted at any moment, she'll be less likely to continue this behavior." Marcus nodded, understanding immediately what Mrs. Wellington was asking of him.
"I can certainly do that. And if I observe anything else that concerns me, you come to me immediately, Mrs. Paul," Wellington said firmly.
"No matter what time of day or night, no matter what I'm doing, Charlotte's safety and well-being take priority over everything else." As Marcus left Mrs. Wellington's study, he felt as though an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had taken the risk of speaking up, and it had paid off. But he also knew that the situation was far from over. Camilla was still in charge of Charlotte's daily care, and until Mrs. Frederick said Wellington could take definitive action, the little girl remained vulnerable. Marcus returned to his duties with renewed purpose. He was no longer just a security guard doing his job. He was now actively working to protect a child who desperately needed an advocate. The sound of Charlotte's cry had awakened something in him that would never again allow him to stand by while someone suffered if he had the power to help. The battle for Charlotte's safety was just beginning, but for the first time since that morning, Marcus felt hope that the little girl's ordeal might soon come to an end. Over the following 3 days, Marcus implemented Mrs. Wellington's plan with military precision. He varied his patrol times and routes, making it impossible for Camilla to predict when he might appear at the nursery door. Each unexpected visit seemed to catch the nanny off guard, and Marcus noticed that her demeanor became increasingly tense and defensive as the pattern of interruptions continued. During his first unscheduled check on Wednesday morning, Marcus found Camilla in the middle of what appeared to be another harsh scolding. Charlotte was standing in the corner of the room facing the wall, while Camilla paced behind her, reciting a litany of the child's supposed failures. When Marcus knocked and entered, citing a need to check the window locks, Camilla immediately switched to a falsely cheerful tone and instructed Charlotte to turn around and greet their visitor properly. The transformation in Charlotte's posture when she turned to face Marcus was striking. Her little shoulders sagged with relief, and for just a moment, her face brightened with what looked like hope. But when Camilla placed a firm hand on her shoulder and squeezed slightly, Charlotte's expression quickly returned to the careful blankness that Marcus was beginning to recognize as her protective mask. "Charlotte and I were just practicing good behavior," Camilla explained with a tight smile. "It's important for children to understand the consequences of their actions. Don't you think, Mr. Thompson?" Marcus nodded noncommittally while making a mental note of Charlotte's red-rimmed eyes and the way she flinched when Camilla touched her. He completed his supposed inspection quickly but thoroughly, giving himself time to observe the overall atmosphere in the room. The tension was palpable, and Marcus could see that his interruptions were having exactly the effect that Mrs. Wellington had hoped for. Thursday brought an even more revealing encounter. Marcus arrived at the nursery during what should have been Charlotte's playtime, only to find the little girl sitting motionless at a small table while Camilla worked on paperwork nearby. When Marcus asked about the unusual quiet, Camilla explained that Charlotte was being punished for breaking a toy earlier in the day and was required to sit still and think about her carelessness. Marcus glanced at the toy in question, a small wooden puzzle that appeared to have had one piece come loose. It was the kind of minor mishap that was completely normal for a 3-year-old, but Camilla was treating it as if Charlotte had committed a serious offense. The child sat with her hands folded in her lap, not moving or speaking, her eyes fixed on the table surface as if she were afraid to look anywhere else. "How long has Charlotte been sitting there?" Marcus asked casually. Camilla consulted her watch with obvious satisfaction. "About 45 minutes now. I believe in natural consequences, Mr. Thompson. If she can't play with toys responsibly, then she loses the privilege of playing with them at all." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. 45 minutes of forced stillness was an unreasonable punishment for any child, let alone a 3-year-old who had simply had an accident during play. He could see that Charlotte was struggling to maintain the position, her small body trembling slightly with the effort of staying perfectly still for so long.
Perhaps I could check the toys for any safety hazards while I'm here, Marcus suggested. We want to make sure everything in the playroom meets our security standards. As he moved around the room, ostensibly examining toys and furniture, Marcus kept up a gentle conversation with Charlotte. He asked her about her favorite colors, her stuffed animals, and her thoughts about the weather. Initially, Charlotte responded only with nods and whispers, clearly terrified of saying something that might get her in more trouble. But as Marcus continued his friendly chatter, the little girl began to relax slightly. "I like purple," Charlotte finally whispered when Marcus asked about her favorite color. It was the first complete sentence he had heard her speak, and her voice was so soft that he had to lean closer to hear her. "Purple is a beautiful color," Marcus replied warmly. "Do you have any purple toys or clothes?" Charlotte's eyes flickered toward a purple teddy bear that sat on a high shelf, clearly out of her reach. "That's Mr. Purple," she said, a tiny smile appearing on her face for the first time. "But I can't play with him today." Marcus followed her gaze to the teddy bear and felt another surge of anger. Camilla had obviously placed Charlotte's favorite toy where she could see it but couldn't reach it, a calculated cruelty designed to make the punishment even more painful. The psychological sophistication of the manipulation was what made it so disturbing. This wasn't just harsh discipline, it was deliberate emotional torment. "Purple looks very nice," Marcus said gently. "I bet he misses playing with you too." Charlotte's smile widened just a little, but when she noticed Camilla looking their way, she quickly returned her attention to the table and folded her hands once again. The speed with which she shifted back into her submissive posture told Marcus everything he needed to know about the level of fear that governed her daily life. Friday's visit provided the most damaging evidence yet. Marcus arrived to find Charlotte in the bathroom, sitting on a small stool while Camilla stood over her with a washcloth. The nanny was scrubbing the child's face with unnecessary force, criticizing her for being messy during lunch, and lecturing her about the importance of cleanliness. "Hold still!" Camilla snapped as Charlotte tried to pull away from the rough treatment. "If you would eat properly in the first place, this wouldn't be necessary." Marcus could see that Charlotte's face was already red from the aggressive washing, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. The child was trying to be brave, but small sobs escaped despite her obvious efforts to remain quiet. When Camilla noticed Marcus in the doorway, she immediately softened her touch and adopted a more reasonable tone. "Children can be so messy at this age," she said with forced lightness. "Charlotte had a little accident with her pudding, didn't you, sweetheart?" But Marcus had seen enough. The contrast between Camilla's behavior when she thought she was unobserved versus when she knew someone was watching was so dramatic that there could be no doubt about her deliberate cruelty. He also noticed that Charlotte instinctively moved toward him when she saw him, as if seeking protection, only to stop herself when Camilla's hand tightened on her arm. That evening, Marcus requested another meeting with Mrs. Apasser, Wellington. He found her in her study, where she appeared to be reviewing some documents, but he could see the tension in her posture and the worry lines around her eyes. She had clearly been thinking about Charlotte's situation constantly since their first conversation. "How bad is it?" she asked without preamble as soon as Marcus entered the room. Marcus chose his words carefully but honestly. He described each of his observations over the past 3 days. Watching Mrs. Wellington's expression grow darker with each revelation. When he mentioned the incident with the teddy bear, her hands clenched into fists. And when he described the bathroom scene, she actually stood and walked to the window as if she needed air. "I can't let this continue," Mrs. Wellington said finally, her voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. "Not for another day. Not for another hour." "What would you like me to do?" Marcus asked. Mrs. Wellington turned back to face him, and Marcus could see that she had reached the same conclusion he had. Immediate action was necessary. "I'm going to dismiss Camilla tonight," she said. "I'll arrange for temporary care for Charlotte until we can find a suitable replacement, but Camilla Hartwell will not spend another night under this roof." Marcus felt a wave of relief so powerful that it left him slightly dizzy. "Is there anything I can do to help with the transition?" "Actually, yes," Mrs. Wellington said. "I want you to be present when I confront Camilla, as a witness, and also because Charlotte seems to trust you. If she becomes upset during the confrontation, your presence might help calm her." Marcus nodded immediately. "Of course. When do you want to do this?" Mrs. Wellington checked her watch. "Now," she said decisively, "Charlotte should be having her bath and getting ready for bed. I want Camilla gone before my daughter goes to sleep tonight." As they walked toward the nursery together, Marcus felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He was grateful that Charlotte's ordeal was about to end, but he also knew that confronting Camilla could be volatile. The woman had invested 3 years in building her position with the family, and she wasn't likely to give it up without a fight. They found Camilla in Charlotte's bedroom, laying out the child's pajamas while Charlotte sat on her bed, already bathed and dressed in a bathrobe. The little girl looked tired and subdued, her earlier energy depleted by another day of walking on eggshells around her caregiver. "Camilla! Mrs. Wellington said, her voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I need to speak with you privately. Marcus will stay with Charlotte." Camilla's eyes darted nervously between Mrs. Wellington and Marcus, clearly sensing that something significant was happening. "Of course," she said slowly. "Charlotte, you stay right there and don't move until I come back." But Mrs. Wellington held up a hand. "Actually, I think Charlotte can get herself ready for bed tonight. She's a big girl. Aren't you, sweetheart?" Charlotte looked confused by this unexpected freedom, but she nodded uncertainly. Marcus settled into a chair near her bed and smiled encouragingly at her, while Mrs. Wellington gestured for Camilla to follow her out of the room. As soon as the two women left, Charlotte seemed to deflate with relief. She looked at Marcus with wide, questioning eyes, as if trying to understand what was happening, but afraid to hope that it might be something good. "Everything is going to be okay," Marcus said gently, though he knew he couldn't explain the full situation to such a young child. "Your mommy loves you very much, and she wants to make sure you're happy and safe." Charlotte climbed down from her bed and moved closer to Marcus's chair. "Are you going to stay?" she asked in a whisper. "For a while," Marcus promised, "until your mommy comes back." In the distance, they could hear voices from Mrs. Wellington's study, one calm and controlled, the other growing increasingly agitated. Marcus couldn't make out the specific words, but the tone of the conversation was clearly heated. He focused his attention on Charlotte, engaging her in quiet conversation about her bedtime routine and her plans for the next day. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Wellington returned alone. Her face was flushed and her expression was grim, but there was also a sense of relief in her bearing. She moved immediately to Charlotte and gathered her daughter into her arms. "Mommy!" Charlotte exclaimed, her face lighting up with genuine joy for the first time in days. "Are you going to read me a story tonight?" "Yes, darling," Mrs. Wellington said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to read you as many stories as you want." Marcus quietly excused himself, knowing that mother and daughter needed time alone together. As he walked back toward the security office, he could hear the sound of Camilla packing her belongings in her room down the hall. Within an hour, she would be gone from the estate forever, and Charlotte would finally be safe. The sound of Charlotte's delighted laughter drifted down the corridor as Mrs. Wellington read her a bedtime story, and Marcus smiled to himself. The little girl's cry for help had been heard and answered. Sometimes breaking protocol was exactly the right thing to do. 3 months had passed since the night Camilla Hartwell left the Wellington estate, and the transformation in Charlotte was nothing short of remarkable. Marcus watched from across the garden as the little girl raced across the lawn with her new nanny, Sarah Chen, a warm and patient woman in her 30s who had come with impeccable references and, more importantly, genuine affection for children. Charlotte's laughter rang out clear and joyful, a sound that had become wonderfully familiar around the estate. The difference was visible in every aspect of Charlotte's life. Where once she had moved carefully and quietly, always checking for approval before speaking or acting, she now exhibited the natural exuberance of a healthy 3-year-old. Her appetite had returned, her sleep had improved, and the dark circles under her eyes had long since disappeared. Most telling of all, she no longer flinched when adults reached toward her or spoke in firm tones. Marcus had played a crucial role in Charlotte's recovery during those first difficult weeks after Camilla's departure. Mrs. Wellington had asked him to spend extra time in the nursery area while they interviewed potential replacements, and during those days, Marcus had discovered that he had a natural gift for relating to children. Charlotte had begun to seek him out during his rounds, chattering excitedly about her day and showing him her toys and drawings, The bond between them had deepened when Charlotte presented Marcus with a crayon drawing she had made of him. It was a simple stick figure in a blue uniform with Mr. Marcus written in uneven letters across the bottom. Wellington had found them both looking at the picture together, Charlotte explaining all the details she had included, while Marcus listened with genuine interest and appreciation. "You know," Mrs. Wellington had said to Marcus later that day, "Charlotte has never drawn a picture of an adult before, except for family members. She must really trust you." Marcus had treasured that drawing, keeping it in his security office where he could see it every day. It served as a reminder of why he had chosen to break protocol that morning when he first heard Charlotte crying. The risks he had taken with his career seemed insignificant compared to the joy of seeing the little girl flourish in a safe and nurturing environment. The hiring process for a new nanny had been exhaustive. Mrs. Wellington had conducted extensive background checks, verified references personally, and insisted on a trial period during which the candidates were observed both openly and discreetly. Marcus had been included in the evaluation process, his insights valued because of his role in exposing Camilla's abuse and his obvious rapport with Charlotte. Sarah Chen had stood out immediately. She was a graduate of an early childhood education program who had worked with several families over the past 8 years, maintaining long-term relationships with all of them. Her references described her as patient, creative, and genuinely caring, but more importantly, Charlotte had responded to her immediately. During Sarah's trial week, the little girl had begun to smile and play again, and by the end of the second week, she was running to greet Sarah each morning with obvious delight. The legal aftermath of Camilla's dismissal had been handled quietly but thoroughly. Mrs. Wellington had consulted with attorneys about whether criminal charges should be filed, but ultimately decided that the emotional abuse, while damaging, would be difficult to prove in court, and that pursuing legal action might be more traumatic for Charlotte than beneficial. Instead, they had focused on ensuring that Camilla would never again be in a position to harm children. Mrs. Wellington had contacted the agency that had originally placed Camilla and provided a detailed account of her behavior. She had also reached out to Camilla's previous employers, discovering that several of them had harbored concerns about her methods but hadn't felt they had enough evidence to take action. Armed with this information, Mrs. Wellington had worked to ensure that accurate references would be available to any future potential employers. Marcus's role in the household had evolved significantly since that September morning when he first heard Charlotte cry. His observational skills and his willingness to speak up had earned him the deep respect of the Wellington family, and his duties had expanded beyond traditional security work. He now served as a kind of liaison between the family and the household staff, his judgment trusted in matters that extended far beyond physical security. The changes weren't limited to Charlotte's care. Mrs. Wellington had implemented new policies for all household staff, including more frequent check-ins, open-door communication policies, and regular feedback sessions. She had also made it clear that anyone who witnessed concerning behavior was expected to report it immediately, regardless of the hierarchy or potential consequences. "What you did required real courage," Mrs. Wellington had told Marcus during one of their regular meetings. "You risked your career to protect a child who couldn't protect herself. That kind of integrity is rare, and it's exactly the kind of character we want throughout our household staff." Marcus had been promoted to head of security, with a significant increase in salary and responsibilities. But more meaningful to him than the professional advancement was the knowledge that he had made a real difference in a child's life. Every time he saw Charlotte playing happily in the garden or heard her talking excitedly with her parents, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction that no promotion or raise could match. The impact of the experience had extended to Marcus's own family as well. His children, now 16 and 13, had listened with pride as he told them about standing up for Charlotte. The story had sparked important conversations about doing the right thing even when it was difficult, and about the responsibility that adults had to protect children who couldn't advocate for themselves. "I'm proud of you, Dad," his daughter Emma had told him. "You could have just done your job and minded your own business, but you chose to care about someone else's kid. That says a lot about who you are." Sarah, his wife, had been equally supportive. As a nurse, she understood the dynamics of institutional authority and the courage it took to challenge established systems when vulnerable people were at risk. She had encouraged Marcus to write down his experiences, suggesting that his story might help others recognize signs of abuse and find the courage to speak up. Marcus had taken Sarah's advice and had begun documenting not just the events surrounding Charlotte's situation, but also the lessons he had learned about observation, intervention, and advocacy. His notes had grown into a detailed manual that Mrs. Wellington was considering sharing with other families and security professionals as a guide for recognizing and responding to potential child abuse situations. One afternoon in December, as Marcus was completing his rounds, he encountered Charlotte and Sarah returning from a trip to the village. Charlotte was carrying a small bag of art supplies and chattering excitedly about a project she was planning to work on that afternoon. When she saw Marcus, her face lit up with the unself-conscious joy that had become her trademark. "Mr. Marcus!" she called out, running toward him with her arms outstretched. "Look what we got at the store." Marcus crouched down to receive her enthusiastic hug, marveling as he always did at the complete transformation in her demeanor. This confident, happy child bore almost no resemblance to the frightened little girl he had found cowering in the nursery corner just 3 months earlier. Charlotte opened her bag to show Marcus the watercolor paints and brushes she had selected, explaining her plans to paint a picture of the garden in winter. Her vocabulary had expanded dramatically since Camilla's departure, and her creativity seemed to know no bounds. Under Sarah's patient guidance, she was discovering her own interests and developing her natural talents. "Are you going to paint Mr. Purple in your picture?" Marcus asked, remembering Charlotte's beloved teddy bear that now occupied a place of honor on her pillow. "Yes!" Charlotte exclaimed. "And maybe I'll paint you too, if that's okay. Sarah says I can paint anyone I want in my pictures." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I would be honored to be in your picture," he said seriously. "That would make me very happy." As Charlotte and Sarah continued toward the house, Marcus reflected on how much his own life had changed since that September morning. He had always taken pride in his work, but now he understood that true security meant more than just checking locks and monitoring cameras. It meant being alert to all kinds of threats, including those that came from within the household itself. The experience had taught him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but rather the decision to do what was right, despite the fear. He had been terrified of losing his job when he chose to confront the situation with Camilla, but he had been even more terrified of what might happen to Charlotte if he remained silent. Marcus had also learned that breaking protocol wasn't always wrong. Sometimes the rules and hierarchies that governed institutions could actually prevent people from doing what was necessary to protect the vulnerable. In Charlotte's case, strict adherence to protocol would have meant leaving her in an abusive situation while he focused solely on his prescribed duties. That evening, as Marcus prepared to end his shift, Mrs. Wellington approached him with an envelope. "Charlotte made something for you," she said with a smile. "She insisted I give it to you before you went home today." Inside the envelope was another drawing, this one much more sophisticated than the first stick figure Charlotte had given him months earlier. It showed the garden of the estate in vibrant colors, with flowers and trees and a bright blue sky. In the center of the picture, a man in a blue uniform was standing next to a little girl with dark hair, both of them smiling. At the bottom, in careful letters that showed Charlotte's growing writing skills, were the words, "Thank you, Mr. Marcus, for keeping me safe." Marcus stared at the drawing for a long moment, feeling the same overwhelming gratitude that had sustained him through the difficult days of Charlotte's recovery. He thought about all the children who might be suffering in silence, hoping that someone would notice their distress and care enough to take action. He thought about the responsibility that every adult had to be vigilant and brave when it came to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. As he walked to his car at the end of his shift, Marcus could hear the sound of laughter coming from the house behind him. Charlotte was playing with her parents in the living room, her voice bright and joyful as she showed them her new art supplies and told them about her plans for tomorrow's painting session. The sound of Charlotte's laughter had replaced the memory of her crying in Marcus's mind, but the lesson of that September morning remained fresh and vivid. He had learned that sometimes the most important part of his job had nothing to do with his official duties, and everything to do with his humanity. The greatest security he could provide was not just protection from external threats, but vigilance against the dangers that could emerge from within the very walls he was meant to guard. Marcus Thompson had answered Charlotte's cry for help, and in doing so, he had discovered something profound about the kind of man he wanted to be.
The little girl's trust had transformed him from a security guard who simply followed orders into a guardian who understood that true protection required both courage and compassion. As he drove home to his own family that night, Marcus knew that he would carry Charlotte's story with him for the rest of his life. It would remind him always that the most important moment in any person's career might not be when they follow the rules perfectly, but when they choose to break them for the right reasons. Sometimes, hearing a child's cry and choosing to answer it could change everything. Not just for the child, but for the person brave enough to listen and act. The sound of Charlotte's cry had awakened Marcus's conscience, but the sound of her laughter had shown him the true reward for following his heart. In a world where it was easy to mind one's own business and avoid complications, Marcus had chosen a different path. He had chosen to care, to act, and to protect. And in making that choice, he had not only saved a little girl, he had discovered the best version of himself.